welcome to this hybrid event. My name's Coretta Phillips and I'm Professor of Criminology and Social Policy, and the reason I'm here is because I was Marcy's PhD supervisor several years ago, as was my colleague Hakan Sejkanalkin. We're so pleased to welcome Marcy back to LSE, to a building, I think, that probably wasn't even here, right, when you were here? Yeah, so the building was designed for football, like this. Also, I'd like to welcome, of course, all of you to this session, and also welcome one of our panellists, Professor Eleonor Kofman, who's joining us online in a very rustic-looking environment. Welcome to you. So I should also note that this event is being supported by the Inter-University Migration Network, which is a collaborative research network bringing together scholars from Anglia Ruskin University, the University of Greenwich and Middlesex University. Before I say a bit more about our esteemed panellists, I'll just do the usual slightly tedious housekeeping things. So in the event of a fire alarm, we will go down the staircase and move out to Lincoln's Inn Fields, which is actually impossible to describe. So if there's a fire, just follow somebody who looks like they know where they're going. Follow Maria, our events organizer. The event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available, made available as a podcast, subject to, as usual, the kind of technical difficulties that sometimes arise. Please can I ask everyone to turn their mobile phones to silent so as to avoid disrupting our speakers. And just before I say a few words of introduction, I would like to thank our events manager, Maria Schlegel, who just is amazing at all of these kinds of events. There's, as you'll be aware, kind of a lot that goes on in the background, and Maria just does it brilliantly and very helpfully. So thank you, Maria, for your contribution. So first of all, our star for this evening is Dr. Marcy Palillo, who's a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Greenwich. She has previously taught at Sciences Po in Paris, in the Champagne region, which just sounds amazing. And also before Greenwich, Marcy was employed at the University of Bradford, but is now back home in London. Eleonor Kofman, thank you for joining us online. Eleonor is Professor of Gender, Migration and Citizenship at the University of Middlesex and co-director of the Social Policy Research Centre and co-cluster lead of the Migration Policy and Society Research Cluster. Thank you for joining us. Alessio D'Angelo is Professor of Social Policy within the School of Law and Social Sciences at the University of Derby, where he co-directs the Centre for Criminology and Social Policy Research. Professor D'Angelo's research centres on the migration welfare policy nexus, the experiences of migrants and the role of migrant community organisations, diversity and inequalities, education and social statistics at both national and European level. And then absolutely not last but least is Isabel Schutz, who's a colleague in the Department of Social Policy here at LSE. Isabel's research centres on inequalities relating to citizenship, migration and mobility, long-term care systems, migration and care work, transnational social protection and social rights. Now, each of our panellists will speak for around 10 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for questions. We'll also have a drinks reception in the foyer afterwards, so we can continue. If we run out of time for questions, then it'll be an opportunity for us to kind of interact informally, which will be great. So I'm going to now hand over to Professor Eleonor Kofman.
Should I start now?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. So Sorry, I can't be with everyone to join you, but I'm on actually a secondment for uh, a network called Incazi. So I'm speaking to you from Barcelona. So, as I say, it is Mediterranean, so we're in the right part of the world in a sense, in relation to Marcy Palillo's book. And thank you very much for asking me to be one of the discussants, because I think the book on forced migration, masculinities, and vulnerabilities in the Mediterranean, refugee men on the margins of Europe, really has made a number of contributions to the concept of how we use vulnerability, and to extend and she's extended it really to the entire experience of mobility, from the reasons why men sought migration as a means of social mobility, or as she calls it, a gendered enterprise, the journeys themselves, then to the encounter with border regimes, and of course reception in Italy. So what I wanted to say is that I will actually speak more about probably some of the early stages, because I think my colleague Alessio will have much more to say about the Italian reception system. But as Marcy actually also, outlines, the scholarship on gendered subjects is really still very largely restricted to women. And it has, again, in relation to vulnerability, been the applicability has been largely limited to humanitarian and asylum discourses and practice. And this really applies very strongly to the concept of vulnerability, which I want to turn to first of all, to illustrate really how the book really pushes the frontiers, I think, of the way that vulnerability has been both conceptualized but also applied. Now, I want to just go back a little bit and say Alessio and I actually conducted an ESRC project called EviMed on Mediterranean crossings largely in 2016 and 2017. And we worked on both Greece and Italy. Obviously, Alessio was doing Italy, and I was much more involved with Greece. But what was interesting is that the concept of vulnerability and the framework of vulnerability had by then been incorporated into EU asylum practice and legislation. And it was actually applied to Greece in a way that it was not being applied in Italy, because to some extent Greece had the involvement of the UNHCR, so it had an external agency that was involved in its reception, in developing its reception systems, unlike in Italy, and very significantly had a much higher proportion of women and children, especially among Syrians, who were in fact at the time the largest group to cross the Mediterranean. And this concept was used in relation to both asylum determination and reception conditions. Now, however, as I noted in a 2019 article that was published in Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies in a special issue, it reflected, or the concept of vulnerability reflected, an essentialist interpretation of the concept, because the assessments were largely based on fixed identities, i.e., having children in one's care, or being disabled, rather than experiences of harm that reproduced hierarchies of deservingness and access to resources amongst asylum seekers. And this allocation or assessment of the degree of vulnerability based on these fixed identities actually shaped and facilitated the allocation of financial resources and policy interventions. So thus, vulnerability was about a performative access to status and resources. Now, interestingly enough, this concept had emerged from feminist thinking about what defines our human experience as a shared condition of interdependency. That is, the degree and the way in which we care for each other that renders all humans ontologically vulnerable to risk and harm. These concepts came from both Judith Butler and Feynman. Nevertheless, certain people, of course, has been commented, may lack the resources necessary to protect themselves from the harm caused by the materialization of context-specific risks and security. Now, Marcy argues in the book that research on refugee masculinities has primarily approached the theme of vulnerability as a concept, as a contested subject position within humanitarian and asylum discourses, and that much less attention has been paid to how vulnerabilities are at play in the gendered and racialized structures of mobilities shaped by the illegality industry, through which these largely young men pass through both in Libya and the European border regime, and how in particular EU management policies across the Mediterranean shape masculine hierarchies. Now, a common narrative in discourses on unauthorized migration towards Europe is that migrants deliberately put their lives at risk without considering how people are actually rendered vulnerable by restrictive border regimes and structural forces that prompt them towards irregular and very dangerous and harmful mobility strategies. So what she argues is that the vulnerabilization of unauthorized migrants should be considered as a social process that addresses migrant bodies and their materiality, not simply as objects of discursive categorization. So we need to think of vulnerability or structural vulnerabilities as the product of patterns of social inequality that constrain individual agency. Now, she sets out also to elucidate how different power positions of vulnerability are dynamically formulated throughout the process of displacement and mobility, including the instigation of displacement itself in the economic, social structures and cultural norms of manhood in societies of origin. And in fact, this is the theme of chapter 3, which is about moving into manhood. Instead of being seen as a reflective of a particular phase or stage, what she argues is that the central migration route or central Mediterranean route can be seen as part of the social reproduction of masculinities within the circuit of global economies that exclude a significant proportion of African youth. And here I think I want to just highlight how original this is, namely that connecting narratives from the route to manhood throughout their journeys through en route and transit in Libya to the reception system in Italy, is which she has captured through in-depth interviews, informal interviews with other participants apart from the 36 male international protection holders and seekers. And in fact, there is a very rich, and I think maybe some others will refer to this, an extremely rich ethnographic work that she has really built up from the whole journey, you say, or trajectory. Now, the interviews were conducted largely with men from West African countries, with two being from East Africa. So focusing on the role of space, she argues that scholars should explore how multiple constructions of hegemonic masculinities are formed across the different levels. And I think this is extremely original way of using Raewyn Collins' notion of the different forms of masculinity. So that basically what we have here is that that in a sense we build up the attempt to try to create social mobility through extremely difficult conditions in the countries of origin. And this is a really very original way of pulling together the different narratives, the narratives of departure, the narratives of movement itself, and the narratives of the arrival in the reception. And I think, in a sense, the concepts both of the attempt to respond to what is seen as a truncated manhood, you could say, is extremely original here in the conceptualization of masculinities. So she argues that emasculation, infantilization, and feminization are not only discursive processes activated by humanitarian practices, but they can also be seen as accounts of migrant men's changing material realities and social positioning within a hierarchical order. But from the time of the position that they find themselves in their societies of origin in relation to cultural norms about what a man should be, how manhood should be achieved, and how this achievement of manhood is disrupted. And as a result of the disruption of manhood, this creates you could say, the push to migrate in order to achieve a higher level of social mobility. So I just want to say that one issue that I am a little maybe concerned about is precisely needing to link this construction of manhood in the societies of origin with broader economic and social processes. But I just want to finish saying that this is an amazing book, pushing really a number of frontiers in relation to the question of how do we conceptualize masculinities in the course of migration? How do we apply vulnerabilization? How do we apply the embodiment in relation to vulnerabilization? And how do we do this, as I say, through a very complex trajectory? So again, congratulations to Marcy for a very fine book based on extremely insightful ethnographic work in the Italian case, but also using the narratives from origins through to the reception centers. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Eleanor, for a really helpful and thoughtful start. It's really nice to hear about the elements of the book, obviously, that originated in the PhD thesis, which are transforming and transformative of knowledge. It's really exciting to hear those elements underlined. Thank you for starting us off, and also for gently offering a criticism that perhaps we can return to subsequently. Thank you. So now we move on to Alessio. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me if I speak like this? Okay. So thanks for having me, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here with Marcy and everyone to celebrate the publication of this book. I mean, it is a book about migration in the Mediterranean, and I think I've got to start with this one rhetorical question, but do we still need books about Mediterranean migration after such a long time? Do we still need to write about what happened 10 years ago in the Mediterranean? I mean, of course, Marcy has been doing fieldwork there, and then I mentioned I was there with her, with Eleonor here, with so many other colleagues, with so many British colleagues. I mean, I don't know if anyone has ever noticed how much British-based research there has been at the point of the refugee crisis. I think there were more researchers UK-based in Sicily at the time of the crisis than Italian scholars. Was quite interesting, and I think it's something probably worth unpacking. I mean, it was certainly an indication of the particular position of the UK back in that point in time, the particular interest and even concern that the public sector and the government of the UK had towards what was happening in the Mediterranean at that point in time. And I think what's happened with the so-called refugee crisis in the Mediterranean has been a turning point in terms of policy approaches, understandings of public discourses around migration, obviously not just in the Mediterranean, but internationally, and very importantly for the UK. I think the extent to which the refugee crisis has then affected the last 10 years at least of UK politics from Brexit and everything else about migration discourses, the Rwanda plan, all of that. There's a very strong connection there, which again, to me, in this point in time, is important to reflect upon. But again, have we learned some lessons, or is there more to say? Well, clearly there is more to say, and I think this book is a masterclass in why it is still important to talk about what happened in the Mediterranean between 2015 and 2017. So yes, we still need books like this. And this book in particular, I mean, I'm not just saying it because I'm here. I mean, I really mean it is a very well written, well researched, well documented book, because it really brings together proper ethnographic qualitative research, but in such a way that raises lots of important points for our understanding of the policy developments in Italy at that point in time, and also how things have been shaped up from there up until now, both regionally and again, Europe-wide. I think it's also a very good example of how you do reflexivity for real. I think in migration studies, there's very often some lip service to reflexivity and positionality. Marcy does it really well. I mean, the way in which she's been using her own position in terms of gender, in terms of being Italian, in terms of being an Italian coming from the UK, in terms of being a white researcher and so on, it's really there at the center of the analysis, and it's really something which is there as a lens to better understand the voices of the migrants. And the voices of the migrants come through very, very powerfully. And I think it's quite strong, the juxtaposition between the voices of individual migrants and then the policy gap, if you want, in terms of those voices really missing in the policy debates. I mean, there's something that you say, I think, towards the final chapters, the extent to which the shaping of reception policies in Italy really doesn't take into consideration the voices of migrants at all. And even the practice of refugee reception doesn't seem to take those voices into consideration at all. And again, it's not just a performative issue, it's actually something that then is reflected in the weaknesses, in the criticalities of that particular reception system. So again, in the concluding chapter, you really see how the approach about bringing in the voices of the refugees is actually what explains the short circuits of a reception system, which is characterized, as Eleonor was saying before, by processes of, yes, infantilization, processes of marginalization, negation of identity, and in these cases, even negation of masculinity in some cases. And the length of masculinity, going back to my question, do we need more research? Well, definitely this book shows why we need research that brings masculinity as a lens of analysis, because in Italy in particular, it's actually quite interesting. I mean, the reception system is a reception system which was there to host, for the large majority, young men, young males. And it's quite surprising that this idea that the males, black young males, were the primary object or subject of the reception system, but it's not necessarily something that comes through very much from the wide literature. So I think this is really addressing an important gap in that respect. And it's also a gap which is quite bizarre to find, because if you then look at the political discourses around that period of time, I mean, there are some chilling examples of the then Interior Minister Matteo Salvini, and how it's actually policymakers or politicians were really using masculinity as a key element to define these migration arrivals as a danger, as a threat. And the reason why the reception system was structured in the way it was, and then it's been actually even defunded over time, was because, or rather, using as an excuse the fact that a lot of these migrants were actually young black men. So I think it's important that as researchers, we put that kind of lens at the center of the analysis. So I don't know how I'm doing with time. I think I probably need to stop it here, but I just want to congratulate with Marcy for bringing all these important issues to the fore, for giving us more opportunities to think about Italy. And well, actually, the other thing I wanted to say, I think when this study happened, Italy was considered kind of the underbelly, the soft underbelly of Europe. It was really very much depicted as an extreme case of bad asylum policies, bad reception mechanisms, and so on. One key difference between then and now is that actually now Italy is increasingly seen as a model by the European Union, as a model even by the UK. I mean, Marcy and I are now writing something comparing the so-called Rwanda scheme and the Albania deal that the Italian government has tried to put together in terms of externalization of the frontier. So Italy is actually being used by many countries, including the UK, as a model or as a justification to show, oh, this is how you do it. And I don't think this has happened because Italy has become much better over the last 10 years, but it's probably because many other countries have become much worse in the meantime. And I'm saying this as an Italian. So lots of reasons why this research is really not just important and well done, but extremely topical for today. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I wonder if Marcy was feeling a little uncomfortable when you said, do we still need research on the Mediterranean in 2015? But luckily, that was a nice way into saying, of course we do. This book's amazing.
How will you respond to
that? I particularly appreciated you picking up this strange lacuna of where race is present but absent in migration studies research, which, as somebody who works in the kind of race field have always found so odd and peculiar. So I think it was really nice to hear a bit more about the kind of methodological and epistemological strengths of Marcy's work too. I'd now like to hand over to Isabel Schutz.
Thank you. So huge congratulations again to Marcy on the publication of your book. I was fortunate enough to be one of the examiners of the PhD thesis, and without spending too much time praising you and your very important work again, I just did want to say how humbling experience what it was for me as somebody who has always, goes without saying, seen the importance of qualitative research to the social sciences and to migration studies, was just so overwhelmed with how impressive your research was, in the sense that you showed such sensitivity towards your research participants, in a way that we rarely see. And often we have discussion about how do qualitative researchers make visible the validity of their research, that we constantly have to defend our work to the quantitative researchers in the field. And that, you know, we need to have metrics to demonstrate the value of our work. And there's lots of ways in which I can say your work really does show value. But I think sensitivity is one way in which I would encapsulate what your research really demonstrates, that ability to really understand and reflect on the experiences of your participants, and that ability to locate those experiences in broader social and economic and indeed political structures, which I found absolutely remarkable. So I just wanted to say that. So I suppose just to pick up on some of the comments that have already been made, I think to reflect on some of the final chapters, I think, and this reflects also on what I've just said, one of the things I found most powerful is how you locate the ways in which vulnerability is produced, structurally produced through the migration regime, but also how vulnerability is experienced by participants. And you build on Geneva's framing of the Mediterranean crisis as being at its core a racial crisis, one that's deeply rooted in the post-colonial condition in Europe. And I would say, to reflect on Alessio's comments, that's why we need more research, because that racial crisis is ever present. And we can see it through the description of experiences of racialized masculinity amongst your participants, exactly the same experiences in front of us today. So what I think it means in practice that you so carefully show is that Europeanness is being constructed and indeed defended as a racial formation, and a post-colonial whiteness experienced as being under threat by the figure of the black male migrant at the borders of Europe. And so on the one hand, a sort of humanitarian framing of the crisis, as you recognise, allows Europe to show it cares. At the same time, to quote de Geneva, the production of Europe through the refortification of those borders has become synonymous with the utter disposability of black and brown lives, which you so powerfully show. And what I think is so valuable is the attention you give to how that racial formation is reproduced and indeed sustained through the asylum system, but in a way, as I've said, that engages fundamentally with the lived experiences of racialized masculinity and indeed racialized vulnerability. But you do so in to pick up on the nuances that you so carefully attend to. You at the same time recognise the painful irony in Sicilian men working in these reception centres as a way of avoiding becoming economic migrants themselves, not having to leave Sicily, while of course those centres are at the same time being publicly framed as a burden on local communities. So racialised refugees are told to go home by white Sicilian people who fear, but of course have feared themselves, that they may have no home to go to. And I thought your reflection on one of your participants, Thierry, that was particularly in describing his containment in a small rural village in Sicily as being actually outside of Europe, that they haven't yet quite made it into Europe, and that leaving that village to visit a larger town was for him going to visit Europe. And of course, that reminds us of the marginalisation of Sicilian rural communities and former migration histories from the margins of Western Europe, which again requires us to locate this crisis and its longer histories. So you vividly capture how racialised men are made hyper-visible, not only in being contained within these reception centres, but under surveillance in public space, subjected to the corrosive humiliations of everyday racism. And you convey that painfully in the practices of social subordination, whereby these men are addressed as tu rather than les, in supermarkets, or not even greeted when they say buongiorno, passing people by on the streets, which I found particularly painful, frankly, to read. And indeed the erosion of relationships and the capacity to actually build a life where their interpersonal relationships with young white Sicilian women is subject to rejection by these women's parents. Yet you argue that black male bodies arriving in Sicily is a past that Sicilians want to forget, locating this racism not in terms of individual prejudice, but as part of that post-colonial tension with deep structural roots. So I suppose what I thought was, sorry, just to pick up on some other thoughts without wanting to take up too much time. I suppose your work really typifies essentially what Patricia Hill Collins reminds us to do, to the extent that we cannot just look at oppression through a single lens, that we have to understand the intersections between gender and race. And indeed, the masculinity that you convey is a racialized masculinity. And I was very much reminded of that in thinking about those intersections between gender and race and how we engage with gender and race in migration studies, as Coretta reminds us, where race is often pretty invisible, frankly, but not in your research. So I suppose what the book ultimately does for me is to refuse us to let the migration crisis be forgotten, or indeed to allow it to be abstract, either in academic or policy debate, that it reminds us that behind this political rhetoric of crisis are people with dignity, with a sense of future that they're trying to build. And you show with great rigor and compassion, essentially, how they are nevertheless trying to build a future under very constraining conditions and encountering the dehumanization of the racialized migrants. You firmly locate the humanness of these men, but not an essentialized humanity. So I suppose just to finally say, you make us see very clearly the racial specificity, I think, of vulnerability. And that in itself, I would say, is a very important and very powerful contribution. So thank you very much, Marcy.
Thank you, Isabel. So again, helping us to situate this piece of research within a kind of broader social science framing is useful, and the kind of the battle between the quant and the quals useful to kind of be reminded of. And I think, I mean, I would also agree that what Marcy does really well is capture what's enormously valuable about qualitative research. And sometimes I think at various points in time when those battle lines are drawn, it's actually useful to be reminded of what those strengths are. And I think that's very much epitomised in what Marcy did. So you now have the opportunity to respond to the comments and thoughts of our panelists. So over to you.
So thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists for their words and their comments. Thank you for all of you. Today was a sunny day. I didn't expect so many people to show up. And also I have to thank you, Coretta and Akan, who were my supervisors, and many of the things that you actually mentioned about my work as strengths of this book come from their guidance, their supervision, and particularly the discussion about reflexivity was a central discussion that we have because of the complexity of the relationship. And I'm going to go there, but first I want to start with your provocative question. Do we need another book about the Mediterranean migration crisis? I think it's a fair question because we have so many good books from different angles. And when I saw the proposal, the anonymous review said something, this is a good historical overview of the refugee crisis, some historical, And I said, I'm not an historian, I'm a sociologist. I'm interested in policy. I've been working in policy for all my life. So I wanted to do something else. And I think the question is, depends on the book. The answer is depends on the book. I think the validity of this book is, as Isabel would say, is about gaining some in-depth insights on the what Geneva calls racial crisis, but in the book I argue there's no one single racial crisis. Migration crises are multiple racial crises because the specific pattern of race relation across Europe. So the book, I think the interesting aspect of this book is the focus on Sicily, and the fact that I'm Sicilian. I come from a family of migrants, and I don't want to talk about too much about race relation in Italy, but Sicilians were for many decades the racial other in Italy, and also abroad. They were even not considered white. We found my great grandfather migration certificate in Alisane, and the racial classification wasn't white. So I was interested in this, and exactly what Isabel said about this past that is in a way almost forgotten but still there. And it's still there from a policy level because gender and vulnerability is still a taboo when it comes to refugee and asylum-seeking men in Italy, but across Europe, continental Europe, and particularly because in Italy there is a resistance in speaking openly about race and racism, right? Except from an understanding of racism as an individual psychological attitude of single people. I was interested in understanding how the emergency reception system that was created, the border regime that was created in response to this significant flows of young Black asylum seekers, mostly from sub-Saharan Africa, was in a way based on this kind of neglected discussion around race. And I know you have visited Sicily. The first time I entered a refugee center, I found this place located in rural Sicily, in the middle of nowhere. And it was a reception center where only young brown and Black men were there. And around them, just the countryside. And they were the only Black people in that town. Oh, no, in some villages, the research center was kind of the only place where Black people were present or were visible. So I think that the book is relevant because it provides some tools to reflect on what Coretta was saying, the race migration nexus, which is still not the focus of research in continental Europe, in Italian scholarship, for sure, Italian migration scholarship, but specifically from a policy and political point of view, it's a taboo. And what I really, I think, and this is, I have to thank Coretta, is the idea of focusing on racialization processes. What I argue in this book is that this book is about masculinity, but especially this version, because maybe the thesis was more on the gender side, but this book is really about racialization. And what I argue is that vulnerabilities as embodied positionality are produced by multiple racialization processes that start in Libya and according to participants and in Sicily and in Europe, right? So when we talk about vulnerability as the product of power dynamics between hierarchy of masculinities, we are talking about race, because sub-Saharan African men are racialized in Libya because of the complex racial relations in Libya, and then in Europe, and then in Sicily. So I think that's what really why the book matters. And I agree with you that when we, and I say we because I know that you did similar research, similar time, when we entered the fieldwork, it was like overcrowded of researchers. That's why I didn't go to big city, or didn't go to Lampedusa. My focus is on specific villages and towns in rural Sicily, where I was the only researcher. But still, I think also my positionality as a Sicilian brings some value, because I'm able and I'm not afraid of questioning the racialization mechanism that Sicilian communities were enacting toward this reception center. I also don't position myself in a kind of enlightened superiority position. I engage with because I'm proud of being Sicilian, and I think Sicilian people are amazing people, and I'm not labeling Sicilian people as racist, but I think racist was a problem in terms of the response that those communities, my communities, were. I also blame the kind of policy framework. In Italy, we had this reception system based on the dispersal mechanism, which means that if you want to be located in this reception center, second level reception center, you have to be located in a specific location. So what happens, this dispersal mechanism is thought to avoid, let's call it, ethnic enclaves in large cities, right? So they don't want to have significant migrant presence in cities like Rome or in the industrial north. So what happens is that given that they're giving money, poorer regions like Sicily and other southern regions were at least back then the most proactive and kind of apply for this funding, because for rural villages it was a source of funding, right? But what happened when you place a group of migrants, in this case, Black young men, in a village where they don't have any any migrant network, they don't have access to faith-based organization, to churches, mosques, they don't have access to good quality job. And also what happens if you don't send them to school because schools are not there, because you rely on, because there are significant implementation gaps. So I think that's the kind of the complexity. And this also, and then I want to finish with reflexivity, but I also want to go back to what Eleanor said. First of all, you have to know that Eleanor is the most cited person in my thesis and my book. So I'm very happy that she liked the book. I think you mentioned something, probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I understood that you were saying that you wanted more discussion of the construction of manhood with connected to economic processes. And I think especially the last chapter, which is kind of the newer contribution to, because it wasn't in the thesis, actually argues that these processes of emasculation and infantilization produced by dispersal mechanism, by what other scholars have called the politics of extortion. So in order to deter people from coming, we need to rely on the mental, physical extortion, putting people in marginalized position, forcing them to relocate, continuously relocate. So what I argue, given that I'm interested in the racialization processes that produce vulnerability as embodied realities of suffering, is that this logic of dispersal, this logic of vulnerabilization, which is a central aspect of this book. We hear about vulnerabilities often, but especially social policy research doesn't engage with it. How we create this vulnerability. So vulnerability, what is vulnerability? So what I argue is that vulnerability in this case is actively created by policy framework and institutional arrangement. And the link with the economic process is that rationalized masculinities in this center become disposable power for Sicilian employer. Especially in agriculture, but also in other sectors, they are highly exploited. They are poorly paid, and there is a strong competition between different group of migrants, because humanitarian migrants, meaning people seeking international protection holders, are provided with some. They should be at least theoretically provided with some money, and so they can compete for lower salaries. And especially in the agricultural sector, this leads to highly exploitative patterns of incorporation in the local labor market. Because Sicily is also a region that has endured historically significant socioeconomic inequalities. And as Isabel was noticing, it's also Sicilian people are migrants themselves. I'm a migrant. I came here because I wanted to pursue an academic career, but in my family, in every generation, there are many, many different migrants. I say that in every Sicilian family, there is a migrant. And I know that Sicilians were racialized in a similar way, not obviously in the same way, but in their migration company. I want to finish on the issue of intersectionality and reflexivity. I think intersectionality is a key term here, because when we follow the vulnerabilization, this continuum of vulnerabilization across different migration stages, we cannot rely on relevant critique of vulnerability as simply a subject position created within humanitarian discourse. Because humanitarian discourse is a very important source of, it's a very important frame of power dynamics for people that are on the move to Europe or they are in our refugee center. But it's not the only social domain. My participants, even those who were in refugee center, in reception center, they have a much more complex life. They were participating in the local economy, they had transnational family, they had a past, and they have a future. So while I agree with the scholarship, amazing scholarship, for example, from Lewis Hahn and others, they argue we should get rid of the term vulnerability because it's not, it's like reproducing the dynamic, the pattern of exclusion and inclusion in produced by the kind of the humanitarian discourse, and we know that humanitarian discourse is a complex history and also white savior complex and so on. But what I argue is vulnerabilities, as they are obviously scholars of humanitarians, so their criticism is fair and actually very relevant. But me as a social policy scholar, researcher, for me it's important to understand that vulnerabilities are an important tool to understand people neglected social policy needs, specifically for marginalized communities. I remember that the most difficult moments of my fieldwork in Sicily was when I interviewed this very young, I think it was 18 or 19, I don't remember, but very young Gambian man. And at some point, he stopped his interview and he started crying. And he told me that I was obviously very, very moved. And I said, why? Well, how? I don't remember what I said, but I was trying to understand why. And he said, I'm crying because my life hasn't improved. So I was suffering in Gambia, now I was suffering tremendously in Libya, and now I'm suffering here. And his suffering was because he couldn't go to school. So since if you read the book, you know his story, his life history. Yaya in the book, his name is obviously pseudonym, but he couldn't go to school across the entire trajectory along the so-called Central Mediterranean route. So for me, vulnerability is a tool to understand social policy needs and demand, and it is because of the complexity of the intersubjective relationship between me as an interviewer, white Sicilian interviewer, interviewing Black migrant African asylum seekers and refugees in Sicily. I don't want to go into the gender aspect because it's much more complex, but it's also relevant there. So I obviously, when you hear about reciprocity in intersectional scholarship, it starts from a position of sharing some sort of common identity. So the challenge here is how can you develop reciprocity when you have such power asymmetries? Obviously, I was so privileged compared to my participant. And my question is, you can't resolve that. So the only way to establish reciprocity is to acknowledge that these power dynamics are inescapable And then the question how you use them obviously to politicize the stories that your participants are telling you, because obviously they're telling you the story because they want something to change in their lives. So that's why I think vulnerability can be a reflexivity informed to understand social policy demand from marginalized communities.
Thank you, Marcy. I think you did a good job of responding to the questions that were raised by our panelists, and also I think doing what's great in the best kind of social policy informed scholarship, which is connecting the macro and the micro, and you know, really keeping that centre stage in the book, but then bringing in the kind of political implications and the policy perspectives too. So thank you. We have 5 minutes or so for questions or comments, reflections from you. We can continue outside in the foyer, but Maria, I don't think there's anyone else coming into the room, right? So we've probably got a little, oh, there is, oh, okay. Right, okay.
Hi, everyone. Possibly I have two, but I don't know if there is time for
Maybe one.
I will ask both, and you pick the one you want to ask to answer. So, well, I come from design, although I do work with refugees as well. So, excuse me if I don't know the field as well as you do your own field. I want to pick up on the label of vulnerability. In design, we do talk about. We also criticize the label of refugees and also vulnerability, and we rather use an asset-based approach. And I think the power of design is that we create conditions for people to actually to strengthen and to highlight the values that refugees can bring and how they can co-design or redesign their own futures. So the question is, how could possibly building on your work collaborate with designers? So in a way that to move for vulnerability towards the assets that they can bring and the skills and the diverse culture, material culture, in order to design better futures. That was one. And the other is more about ethics. And I don't know as well the ethical framework that you used in your research. And I know so much emphasis is often on the ethics for participants. You did bring up an episode in which the refugee started to cry, and that happened also to me in my research. But my question is more about researcher self-care, because I would imagine you have opened yourself a lot in being vulnerable, and as well considering your own history in terms of gender and migration, etc. How did you cope with your own well-being or looking up or self-care while undertaking this very complex work?
I'll go with the second. The first one is a bit more complex, but we can talk about it. I want to share actually the first day of I believe of the first or second day of my fieldwork. I went to this reception center totally prepared, because obviously I did my methodological training here. I took my ethnographic model. Obviously I had done my major review and everything. So, but this was the first time I was doing ethnographic research, and my supervisor had prepared me about the complexity. So I arrived there, and there were only men in the refugee center. And as you might know, I had some troubles with my relationship with masculinity. So now my supervisor understands why I did a PhD on masculinities after many years. So I was in a position of very, very, very kind of discomfort, because one of the people there, one guy asked me to play football, football, and I don't know how to play it, and I hate football. Sorry, I don't like football, and also for me was really, really, really bringing back like memories of happy memories about football. Because football is in Italy such an important element of competent masculinity. And I didn't know what to do, because if I don't do this, I will never establish rapport. So I tried. It went very bad. I was totally at the point I saw that they probably shouldn't be played. And I said, okay, so I went back to the corner. The reality is that, and I write about this, ethical procedures are very important, especially with refugees. And there is obviously an element of bureaucratic scrutiny, of self-preparation, good books that you get. But the reality is that you have to live the experience of the fieldwork, and there's no way to anticipate what's going to happen. The only thing that you can do is going back to what I was saying about reciprocity, which is also self-care about yourself and your positionality.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have run out of time since there are other people trying to come into the room, but please join me in thanking Marcy and all our panelists.
Thank you.